our families.
An upcoming program on C-SPAN 2's Book TV.
Gore Vidal's latest collection is called Dreaming War, Blood for Oil and the Cheney-Bush Junta. In it, he argues that large corporations, American foreign policy, and the Bush administration are the catalyst behind America's war on terror. Recently, he sat down with Nation magazine editor Katrina vanden Heuvel and WNYC radio host Leonard LePate at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. It's an hour and 10 minutes.
These are times when what used to be called liberal is now called radical. What used to be called radical is now called insane. What used to be called reactionary is now called moderate. And what used to be called insane is now called solid neoconservative thinking. So it is very good to be here, for the head and the heart, to be here tonight with people of sanity and passion who've come to hear a defender of the American Republic, perhaps America's last small R Republican, Gore Vidal. And thanks to our co-sponsors, the New York Society for Ethical Culture, the Public Concern Foundation, and Democrats.com. It is almost as if in normal times a magazine like The Nation is a holding action waiting for a moral or political crisis to happen, and it has. As Gore Vidal has said, we are not so much on the brink as fallen over it. And I would guess that all of us in this hall tonight weep for what is happening to our country. We know that when it comes to defending our fragile democracy, to restoring citizen control of our government, or reigning in corporate power, we're in the fight of our lives. And that fight needs a media, needs a Gore Vidal, who will defend the spirit and letter of our Constitution and defy the bullies who say questioning this administration and its motives is unpatriotic. At The Nation, we refuse to be cowed or silenced, even when called names by Aussie rags masquerading as newspapers. And by their electronic media affiliates determined to make us what Gore Vidal would call the United States of amnesia. In this time of thuggish conformity, the nation's independent, rebellious, and sane voice refuses to be drowned out by false patriotism, conglomeratization, and Murdochization. That spirit of independence runs through the empire we at The Nation and Nation Institute are building, yes, empire, from the largest circulation weekly of political opinion in this country, to a national weekly radio show, to an internship program that has launched hundreds of young journalists, a kind of guerrilla network, into the mainstream and alternative press, and now Nation Books, a new co-publishing venture of the Nation Institute and Thunder's Mouth Press. It delights us that a great and ferocious opponent of empire, Gore Vidal, has contributed to the success of the Nation empire. His book, Dreaming War, in its 8th week on the New York Times bestseller list and its umpteenth week on the LA Times bestseller list. That success seems good evidence to me of the hunger in this land for antidotes to the right-wing bigots and blowhards who market treason and slander and bias and bullshit. No one is better suited to skewering their idiocies than Gore Vidal, master essayist, historian of power and empire stretching from Rome, Washington, D.C. to Hollywood, defender of the republic for which it truly stands, and a believer in argument and provocation without end, not war without end. Let me end by returning to another time in our country's history, a few years before 1865 being the year the nation was founded by a group of abolitionists. Wendell Phillips, one of the leading abolitionists, was asked, "Wendell, why are you so on fire?" He replied, "I'm on fire because I have mountains of ice before me to melt. Since Phillips left the scene, those mountains have grown ever higher, and we need more fire to melt them. So tonight, let's melt some ice with Gore Vidal, and let's take the fire out of this hall and melt that Cheney Bush junta, which Gore so skillfully indicts. I turn this evening over to Leonard Lopate, America's gift to the interview, and host of a daily show on WNYC, The Leonard Lopate Show. Thank you.
And Gore, I understand that you'd like to start off by reading some things.
Yes, but very briefly. And I look up from time to time in order to give an air of spontaneity. Hearts sink when they see a great sheaf of papers and a grim look on the speaker's face. I'm delighted to be here. I'm particularly delighted. It's so many old friends I see here and there. And one of the great heroes of my lifetime politically is in this hall, Senator George McGovern.
One of the only votes I have never regretted making.
George, run. This is the year. I'm also very grateful for him that he got me the biggest laugh I've ever had in a hall. It was in 1972 when Nixon won, and there was not much to laugh about. And I was speaking in Boston, a large, youthful audience, and the questions afterwards, and somebody said, how do you explain that we here in Massachusetts were the only state to vote for McGovern? And I said, well, I could compliment you and say, Boston is the Athens of America, and they started to applaud dutifully, and I said, no. I said, it's not that. I said, since the beginning of the Republic, Massachusetts has been the most corrupt state in the Union, and you know a crook when you see one. I was not asked immediately back to that venue. There are a couple of quotations I'd like to throw out to sort of set a theme to why we are here. There's a quotation from Benjamin Franklin, and you cannot find it in any of the high school history books, and not even in proper history books, except rarely. And it occurred, Franklin has always been depicted as one of the great bores of the founding fathers, and he, of course, was one of the most interesting. In 1789, he was at Philadelphia for the making of the Constitution. He's old, dying, and he finally read the handiwork of his fellow conventioneers, and he didn't like it. But he thought about it, and then he got up and he made a very interesting speech. He said, I think that we should accept this Constitution for all of its errors and omissions. At that time, the Bill of Rights was not in there. I think because it will give us, for a course of years, good government, which is what we need right now. And then in due course, as it would give good, it may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe that this is likely to be well administered, and then only end due to the corruption of the people in despotism, which will be the only form of government suitable for them. This is as dark a statement as anyone has ever made. They got around to the best of the high school history books I saw American pageant, I think it is, said that they were so afraid for Franklin, he kept going to dinner parties, and his conversation was quite brilliant. They were terrified that he would give his true opinion of how this thing would end. So they had a couple of young men going around with him sitting on either side. So when Benjamin Franklin said, well, let me tell you about the Constitution, they'd say, good, you pass the salt, Mr. Franklin. I thought of that, needless to say, when Franklin's prophecy came true in December 2000, when the Supreme Court bulldozed its way through the Constitution in order to select as their president the loser in the presidential election of that year. Despotism is now securely in the saddle. Is it due to the corruption of the people? Well, I thought, well, what is corruption? The founding fathers were always, many of them, on the verge of it. Others in the Congresses were, the blankets didn't get to Valley Forge because it couldn't pass Congress that was sitting in Philadelphia. Corruption has always been with us, but when it becomes so total that you allow an election and to make no contest, there was no outcry across the country when this terrible manipulation took place. And then, of course, Enron and Anderson, it is taken for granted that these great companies are like this, that CEOs are taking all the money that is not nailed down, and people out of work with no relief to fall back upon. So now I think what we might chat about is that despotism is really in the saddle, and the old republic is a shadow of itself. And we now stand in the glare of a nuclear world empire with a government that sees as its true enemy we, the people, deprived of our electoral franchise. War is the usual aim of despots, and serial warfare is what we're going to get, unless with help from well-wishers in new old Europe and from ourselves, awake at last, we can persuade this peculiar administration that they are acting on their own and against all our history. The other night on CNN, I brought the admirable Aaron Brown to a full stop. I do not do 19th century Fox. I brought him to a full stop not with Franklin, but with President John Quincy Adams, who said in the 1820s on the subject of our fighting to liberate Greece from Turkey, "The United States goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. If the United States took up all foreign affairs, she might become the dictatress of the world, but she would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit or soul." Should we be allowed in 2004 to hold a presidential election here in the homeland, I suspect we shall realize that the only regime change that need concern our regained spirit or soul is in Washington. President Adams is long since dead, and we have now been in the empire business since at least 1900 with the conquest of the Philippines. The local population did not want us there. We promised them independence. We killed 220,000 of them while subduing them. A few years ago, there was a significant exchange between the then General Colin Powell and the then statesperson Madeleine Albright. Like so many civilians, she was eager to use our troops against one of our many, many, many enemies. Everywhere we look, there's somebody lurking who might one day find a special death ray and turn it on us. One could hardly sleep at night knowing these dangers all around us. When Powell said no, she said, "What's the point of having all this military and not using it?" He said, "They are not toy soldiers." But in the interest of fighting communism, we did spend trillions of dollars until we are now threatening to sink under the weight of so much weaponry. Much of it we have shifted over on to Afghanistan and Iraq. I suppose it was inevitable that sooner or later a new generation would get the bright idea. You read that thing in the Sunday Times today on the neocons and their background intellectually, which turns out to be from a book by my friend Saul Bellow called Ravelstein, is that it?
Well, first Leo Strauss.
Yeah, Leo Strauss, who was actually a nice old-fashioned classicist, but he's been taken up by Wolfowitz and Cheney and the lot as a kind of guru, since he seems to believe empire is very important and empire is based classically on force. So why stop fooling around with diplomacy and treaties and coalitions and just use our military power to give orders to the rest of the world? A year or two ago, a pair of neoconservatives put forward this exact notion, Mr. Kagan and the young Mr. Crystal. I responded in print that if we did so, we would have perpetual war for perpetual peace, which is not good for business. Then the Cheney-Bush junta seized power. Although primarily interested in oil reserves, they like the idea of playing soldiers too, and if you call it a war, you have wartime powers for the president. Last summer, Congress received from the administration a document called the National Security Strategy of the United States. As the historian Joseph Stromberg observed, it must be read to be believed. The doctrine preaches the desirability of the United States becoming, to use Adams' word, dictatress of the world. It also said, it used to be Nicaragua was quite enough, now it's going to be Korea, China. It also assumes that the president and his lieutenants are morally entitled to govern the planet. It declares that our best defense is a good offense. The doctrine of preemption is next declared. As a matter of common sense, they write, and self-defense, America will act against emerging threats before they are fully formed. Now, this is a kind of madness. This is not what we started the country for. It's not what the rest of the world wants. I mean, it is as if, I'm sure, at this very moment, good General Ashcroft, brave officer of the junta that he is probably up in Utah arresting Mormon boys before they grow up and then kidnap 8 girls for future wives. They're going to do it. We know the danger. If you put them all in prison, in concentration camps, those girls are safe, thank God. Danger, danger everywhere we look. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that only Congress can declare war. But Congress surrendered that great power to the president in 1950 and has never taken it back. As ex-Senator Simpson, and he was one of my favorite clowns, said so cheerily on TV the other evening, the people of the United States don't declare war. The commander-in-chief does. So in great matters, we are not guided by law, but by faith in the president, whose powerful Christian beliefs preach real faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. In response to things not seen, the USA Patriot Act was rushed through Congress 45 days after 9/11. We are expected to believe that its carefully crafted 342 pages were written in that short time. Actually, it reads like a continuation of Clinton's post-Oklahoma City Anti-Terrorist Act. The Patriot Act makes it possible for government agents to break into anyone's home when they are away, conduct a search, and keep the citizen indefinitely from finding out that a warrant was issued or not. They can oblige librarians to tell them what books anyone has withdrawn. If the librarian refuses, he or she can be criminally charged. They can also collect your credit reports and other sensitive information without judicial approval or the citizen's consent. Finally, all this unconstitutional activity need not have the slightest connection with terrorism. Early last month, the Justice Department leaked Patriot Act 2, known as the Domestic Security Enhancement Act. As of January 9, 2003, it has not yet gone to Congress, but it has certainly been leaked, and I saw parts of it. Here's a provision. If an American citizen, born American citizen, has been accused of supporting an organization labeled as terrorist by the government, he can be deprived of his citizenship, even if he had no idea the organization had any link to terrorism. Provision of Act 2 is also made for more searches and wiretaps without warrant, as well as Section 201, secret arrests. In case a citizen tries to fight back in order to retain the citizenship he or she was born with, those federal agents who conduct illegal surveillance with the blessing of high administration officials are immune from legal action. A native-born American deprived of citizenship would presumably be deported, as today a foreigner-born person can be deported. Also, according to American citizens, the provision has some wonderful language in it. It says he can be deported, he's stripped of his citizenship, deported from the United States. Then they suddenly thought, well, what country would want him, you know? We better rephrase this. Because he can't, of course, get a passport, as he doesn't have citizenship. So the thoughtful devisers of our domestic security enhancement authorizes the Attorney General to deport him, quote, to any country or region, regardless of whether the country or region has a government. Well, it sounds like heaven to me. Anyway, that's how you get rid of the Bill of Rights in one big sweep. Back in '39, our greatest historian, Charles A. Beard, wrote, "The destiny of Europe and Asia has not been committed under God to the keeping of the United States, and only conceit, dreams of grandeur, vain imaginings, lust for power, or a desire to escape from our domestic perils and obligations could possibly make us suppose that Providence has appointed us his chosen people for the pacification of the earth. Those Americans who refuse to plunge blindly into the maelstrom of European and Asiatic politics are not defeatist or neurotic. They are giving evidence of sanity, not cowardice, of adult thinking as distinguished from infantilism. They intend to preserve and defend the Republic. America is not to be Rome or Britain. It is to be America."
With that last quote from Charles Beard in mind, I'm reminded that one of your characters in... I have no control over it. Can somebody turn it up, please? One of the characters in The Golden Age, your last novel, The End of the American Chronicles, says that America started out wanting to be like Greece and ended up like Rome. What is your response to Neil Ferguson's suggestion that the real problem for Americans is that we refuse to acknowledge our imperial role in the world? That we are hypocrites because we do it, we're proud of it, and at the same time we make believe that we're not imperial.
Well, you've got to remember Mother. That was England. I mean, they invented hypocrisy. We are mother's children, at least we were in the beginning of the country. We couldn't disappoint mother by speaking out honestly that we wanted to Christianize those Indians whose land we took. And we did. They all had Christian burials. Essentially, we were undertakers for Jesus.
You sometimes quote Tolstoy's remark that history would be an excellent thing if it were only true.
Leo knew a thing or two.
And that's why you have written historical novels along with the nonfiction?
Oh, historical novels, I'm generally so disappointed in what I call court history, which is most of what we get from academe. It's history written for, I don't know, to get tenure, a lot of it, or to please the trustees, paint a golden picture of the management, which is corporate America nowadays. I mean, a friend of mine has written a very successful book. I will not mention his name, as I don't want to hurt his feelings. Somebody will tell him anyway. But about John Adams, making him into the cuddliest teddy bear you ever did see.
I have no idea who you're talking about.
I know you don't. And you're not going to draw me out. Adams was an incredibly brilliant, thoughtful man, and marvelously neurotic, and filled with vanity and self-pity. They seem to go hand in hand in certain characters. So he writes this book, and we don't get the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is the background of what is going on in Washington now with the USA Patriot Acts, in which we no longer have due process of law. We can be arbitrarily arrested, deported, etc. You don't mention that about Adams, and then you write a big bestseller where you have a chance. I would say that is, if not history, that's historical biography. That cheats. I've done my best to correct certain views that I thought. I write them as novels. I don't invent any. I don't have George Washington looking out the window, wondering, why did I marry Martha? I don't know if he ever thought that, and I don't care if he ever thought that. When I have historical figures in a book, whatever they say that I record, they actually said, as far as the record goes. I've got it from letters, diaries, journals, and the made-up characters are simply my way of commenting. Far better to have a couple of invented people, or near invented. In my case, would say John Hay, secretary to Abraham Lincoln. He kept lots of journals. I will occasionally go into his mind to quote something that he'd written, not that he'd said. It gives you a sense of the atmosphere of the time, what they were like when they were talking. I'm doing one now on for Yale on the founding of the Republic, and I'm narrowing it down. It's a slender volume called Inventing a Nation. And I've got it down to the one person who's never mentioned, that we don't know about and don't really care about, is George Washington. And without him, it wouldn't have happened. And he is terribly interesting. If you give him the time of day, he's not as interesting as Jefferson. With the slave girl, which I wrote about back in Burr, that was 1973. Dumas Malone, who was a great court historian and academic, who'd done 6 volumes biography of Jefferson. I mean, each book would sink Manhattan. And he attacked me for my view of Jefferson, and said Vidal is subversive. This was in the era of communism, I suppose, when he says that Jefferson could have had an affair with Sally Hemings, which DNA has now proved that indeed he had. And I thought that, is this the way to write history? The evidence for it is so great. Then he says, as a clincher, no gentleman in the Old South, in the Confederacy, and he was from Virginia too, would ever have an affair with a slave.
Maybe not an affair.
Well, an encounter. And I said, so I responded to Malone, and I said, so you are willing, upon a false syllogism, to construct a false figure of Thomas Jefferson. I'm happy to say he died thinking that perhaps I was right. Too many other people had got to him on the subject.
Well, it is really getting hard to tell what is fact and what is fiction, just reading the newspapers. And you
Well, that's mostly fiction. It's the new novel, the New York Times.
For example, in the lead up to the war with Iraq, the whole idea that Iraq posed an immediate threat to the security of the United States. And that was before no weapons of mass destruction ever were turned up. I wonder if you think they ever will be found.
Well, I suspect they're planting them there right now.
And why has the press pretty much dropped out? Do you think that the media have been subjecting us to weapons of mass distraction?
Because I wish I'd said that.
Because right now, what we're getting is, beyond the triumphalism, is all this other stuff. But the whole point of this war seems to have been forgotten, or people are saying, well, it really didn't matter anyway.
I would say a people with what was once quite a good republic, never perfect, but it tended to get better, more liberal, as I explained to Mr. Combs, is that I don't go on the TV with these, Alan Combs, yeah. And I said, we were on radio together, and I said something about, well, of course, people of your political persuasion want this war, and this was during the Bill Evans. He said, no, I'm the liberal, remember? And he made a mistake, as I hoped he would. Never answer a question that's put to you, particularly if you're the questioner. So I let him go on a bit, and then I said, what do you think the word liberal means? I listen to you people talk. I'm a conservative. I'm a liberal. You're a Hollywood liberal. You're this. You're that. I said, you use these words. You don't know what they mean. I said, without liberals, we'd have no Social Security. That was a liberal act of 1935 from Roosevelt and Congress. Without the liberal Roosevelt, we would never have had the GI Bill of 1945, which gave a whole new class of citizens to America. Everybody could be educated in college then. So I said, what do you think the word means? Well, he said it means to be relaxed about, free about things. And so I said, no. I said, Webster's dictionary, which as far as I know is not a red front dictionary, defines a liberal as someone who favors political action toward the extension of democracy. And Mr. Combs, is that his name again?
Alan Combs.
Alan Combs, I have never heard you in the many few times that I've heard you ever say anything that would have extended the democracy. Tolerance, perhaps, but democracy, no.
Well, maybe that explains why, if we interpret that in another way, that so many liberals like Christopher Hitchens, Paul Berman, Todd Gitlin, Nat Hentoff have supported this war. Do they see it as an extension of democracy?
Well, I was not aware that Mr. Gitlin was ever a liberal.
He used to be he was a member of SDS at one point.
Oh, yes, everybody's been a member of something sometime or other. And then they do a mea culpa and get forgiveness. That's the great thing that the Christian right did, was a celebrity falls on bad times, becomes a devout born-again Christian, and then is given work, goes around the country proselytizing, has a whole new career. As Christopher Hitchens appointed himself my heir years ago, and I found him a very bright kid. I first knew him when he was about 20 in England as a New Statesman. We both wrote for it. And he's had a sea change. So he is no longer my heir. The Dauphin, I used to call him, or Delfino, which is the word for dolphin in Italian. I never translated that.
Nat Hentoff.
Nat Hentoff is a worthy figure, but I've never, and I know him slightly, I've never found him very interesting on anything, you know. I think they see their opportunity. The money's on the right. Look, if you need money and attention, they've got all these little papers out there, the Weekly Standard. They have all these. The Mellon, what's his name? Scaife Mellon's think tank. That was their wisdom, which is to collect up all of the flotsam and jetsam of the intellectual world and overpay them and have them produce speeches, which poor W has trouble mouthing, but he does get through them. At least they're making him suffer when he has to read one of those things.
By the way, I've been asked to remind you that cards have been handed out, and if you want us to ask your question, we're obviously not going to get to them all, but please write your question down, and they'll be collected in a few minutes. Now, you've talked about the Patriot Act, but your hero, as far as I can tell, or one of your major heroes, was Abraham Lincoln, and he suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Don't presidents always tend to cut back on our civil rights in times of crisis?
Well, that's in Lincoln acted under the Constitution. The Constitution said, in case of invasion or sedition, the president may indeed suspend habeas corpus. It's in Article, it's under the presidency, whatever that is, Article 4. No, that's Article 1. Anyway, Lincoln did a lot of pretty bad things. I mean, he could never make his case. He was not an abolitionist, as we know. So he couldn't be on moral high ground by saying that he was going to keep the South from seceding in order to free the slaves. He had no intention of that. He was a unionist, and he saw the country would be broken in half if the South went. He has to think of a reason, legal reason, and he got into a rather mystical mood because there was no constitutional. The states had come together of their own free will. They could part. That was the understanding from the beginning. So he said, when finally challenged, he said, well, I have done this, and I am committed, we are committed to a great civil war because these states want to go. I have an oath which is registered in heaven to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and they shall not go. Well, that's how he took it. It's just as well, since it was my great-grandfather, not I, who had to fight in it, just as well it happened.
You quote another of the Founding Fathers, James Madison, in War II, the discretionary power of the executive is extended, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. Sounds like something Karl Rove would have written.
Well, it's something he read.
So when you quoted that, were you saying that the war with Iraq was waged in order to seduce our minds and subdue the public's power?
Oh, yes. The junta is after oil. First of all, they're all oil people. Cheney, the Bushes, Condoleezza Rice, who was Texaco, Exxon. There are about 8 of them in high places. Now, we cannot use the word conspiracy anymore because that's the media has worked over that one. If you say something is a conspiracy, oh, you believe in flying saucers, do you? Mm-hmm. Out-of-body experiences, So I have advised everybody, anytime I'm on television and we get into this subject, I say it is not a conspiracy, it's a coincidence that they all work for oil companies. And certainly like a war, because you can suspend the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. I mean, just think of it's black comedy, but the comedy of we give the Pentagon vast money, which Bush then declares a war, which you can't do against terrorism as it's an abstract noun. You can against a country. So he goes in under wartime powers, And you can almost see a commander in the field with somebody from Halliburton beside him or Bechtel and say, okay, take out the railroad station. We've got a very good model for one now. And so you take that out. They take out the railroad station in Baghdad, and then immediately they've already signed a contract with the government to rebuild it. The idea that you might not knock it out at all, that you might leave it alone, does not occur to them. That would be too simple. So a fortune is going to be made by Bush and friends. And then I advert yet again to Benjamin Franklin. If this is not the total corruption of a people, I don't know what is.
Did you see the letter that Representative Henry Waxman sent to Donald Rumsfeld earlier this week, pointing out that Halliburton Company subsidiaries have done work in Iran, Libya, and Iraq. In fact, Iraq as recently as 1999, in spite of U.S. sanctions against these countries. And he wondered whether the Halliburton should be receiving new lucrative government contracts. I'm wondering whether they shouldn't be brought to trial.
Or sent to a region without a government. And hence no contracts.
But it is interesting to see how they got away with it.
Well, everybody gets away with everything. I mean, the media is bought. The media is hopeless. It has never been more atrocious. It has never been much good in my lifetime, certainly. And I'm reading a lot of 18th century press, and it was pretty lousy then.
But George really went after Clinton. How come nobody's going after this man?
Well, they will, because he's going to fail. The economy is going to crash. You can't just go on saying, I'm just sick and tired of the way they're acting over there. I'm sick and tired of the fact that the people didn't take the occasion of the midterm election to change the Congress.
Well, the polls remain very strong for George W. Bush.
I don't believe those polls, and anybody who's been in politics knows that it's, or in selling anything, it's the way you ask the question. And a couple of times on television, they've allowed somebody to get away with showing how it happens. You say, after the vicious, grievous attack of 9/11 by Muslim zealots, George Bush went to war for America and for those dead in New York and in the Pentagon. And he has finally won over Osama bin Laden and over Afghanistan and over Iraq, Saddam. Do you approve of that? Sure I do, if you put it like that. He's not popular. And once they figure out who he is, now who's going to tell them? I have, you and I can go around and talk to audiences, but, you know, New York Times will not cover what we have to say. We'll be buried, if present at all. Only certain things can be mentioned, other things people are silent about. I've never seen people so silent. Wherever you go, they seem to be afraid somebody's listening.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that any kind of criticism is being treated as treason today? Are we returning to something like what we went through with McCarthy?
Oh, this is much bigger than McCarthy. He was just one lone publicity-mad senator who got his in the end. This is a very serious coup to seize all the oil resources on Earth, if possible. Certainly starting with Iraq, going into Caspian Sea oil, through the pipeline, through Afghanistan. This is an all-out venture there. Then when they saw how easy it was to pull this off, and no voices said no, because Congress, the Democrats, were too afraid of being accused of yellow-belly treason. Then they got bigger and bigger in what the things they grabbed. Now they are doing this to the Bill of Rights, just smiling. There goes due process of law. Bye-bye. This is atrocious stuff. This has never happened to us before. We have never had anything close to it. Yes, FDR was a dictator in World War II, he did less damage in the years of that war than these people managed in a week or two within the country with their Patriot Acts and also to the alleged enemy. Iraq, we still haven't found what it was they did to us, but we keep looking.
Well, why do you predict that George Bush will lose if, first of all, he is pretty much taking control of this country, as you suggest, and also the Democrats really have nobody out there. There are 9 candidates. I don't know who you favor right now. I want George McGovern to come back into the race.
Well, by the way you phrased your question, you delivered the answer to it. You personalized it. It doesn't depend on one man or one woman who is magnetic and so on, and brilliant and right-minded. It depends upon a change in the citizenry, that they think that they can do something about anything. They don't care at the moment, and it's to make them care. Well, the economy is going to crash. You cannot sustain as much as, $5 trillion of debt that we now have. More and more money for armaments, less and less money for veterans. You can't go on like that.
2 million people have lost their jobs since this president took over.
Well, yesterday, 6% unemployment in the land. This is unheard of when we had a surplus, some of it done with mirrors and smoke, but it was a genuine surplus at the end of Clinton. They got rid of that. And now they are going to, in the name of conquest, though it'll always be to bring liberation to the Arab people that we've always cared so much for. We're going to roll up our sleeves and give them liberty and freedom and a country just like ours. Poor bastards.
In your most recent book, you link the events of 9/11 with Pearl Harbor in ways that others have not. Can you explain that?
Roosevelt was a genuine lover of, not so much of England, yes. He certainly hated and feared Hitler. And as of 1940, and I was very active politically, although I was a schoolboy at Exeter, I was the head of the America First up there, because we were having a great debate about war and peace. I mean, every school was arguing about it. And then we have Iraq, a huge war, and nobody argued about it. I didn't hear two sides ever that made any coherency. Roosevelt saw that 80% of the American people did not want to go to war to stop Hitler or to go to war in Europe for any reason at all, to save England, to restore France. We'd had it in 1917. The First World War, the only thing it brought us was prohibition. Not a good thing in liberal land. And Roosevelt then did something very daring. It has all been perfectly, I quote Charles A. Beard, he wrote the first book on the subject. Roosevelt maneuvered the Japanese, who had a treaty with the Axis powers, with Germany and Italy, to come to the aid of each other in the case of war. He got them to attack us at Pearl Harbor. He knew perfectly well something was going to happen. As far as we know, he didn't know that they had Pearl Harbor in mind. From what I got from Mrs. Roosevelt, she said, well, we expect to be struck, but we thought it would be Manila next door, which somehow was better than Pearl Harbor when they got the fleet. Roosevelt had been reelected president in 1940. And I promise you, mothers and fathers, that no sons of yours will ever serve overseas unless we are attacked. Well, he was honest about his resolutions to the people. He kept the faith there. But he cut off their fuel, oil, their oil supplies, and scrap metal. The Japanese had nothing left to do but bomb us, hoping they could knock us out for a year or so while they went down to Java and grabbed all the oil wells, which they pretty much did. But they hadn't realized, a lot of people in Japan realized this was a fatal blow, but they shouldn't have done it anyway. Then we had a great ally at that time for Roosevelt getting us into the war, which was Hitler. Clever old Adolf declares war on us, which gives, there's the game. Now we're in the European war. It was a funny moment at the Nuremberg trials when Justice Jackson, who was a prosecutor, asked Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, he said, just out of curiosity, this is during a formal questioning, but he said, as an aside, he said, would you tell me why Hitler declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor? And Ribbentrop said, well, we had a treaty with Japan. Then, said Jackson, why was that the only treaty you ever honored in 20 years?
But are you suggesting, by linking the two, that 9/11 was similar in that way? Whether it's true that FDR knew or not, and many historians disagree with you on that. Let's say it is true.
I think fewer do now, anyway.
Then did George W. Bush or his administration know that Osama bin Laden planned to do something on 9/11 or thereabouts?
You're asking the wrong person. I am not intimate with those people, so I don't know what they knew. One of the reasons I never went in for journalism was that I don't like to give my opinions as facts. I like to give the facts, preferably facts that other people haven't found out yet or don't know about. But now we're in the realm of possibility. And with this gang, I would say anything is possible, but there's no proof. I leave the charges to others, or the proof stuff.
Although you have, there was an essay from August 2001. You say, James Baker, Department of Justice's Counsel for Intelligence Policy, has already warned us terrorism is everywhere on the march. That was a month before 9/11 you wrote that essay.
Yes. We were getting lots of warnings. We also know that Mubarak of Egypt, Putin of Russia, 3 members of Mossad had warned our government that something unpleasant was going to come out of the sky. And we did nothing.
And you quote a New York Times report that as early as 1996, Pakistani terrorist Abdul Hakim Murad confessed to federal agents that he was learning to fly an aircraft in order to crash a plane into CIA headquarters.
That is quite true. That was in the New York Times. People say, where do you get your information? I said, well, I actually read these newspapers. And anybody who can read as much of the Wall Street Journal as I have, because they're very good on fact stories, particularly if money is involved. And I learned a lot from watching Izzy Stone, who was our greatest journalist. And Izzy read everything that came out of the government printing office. Sooner or later, they blab everything. And they know nobody will ever read it. I mean, it's this turgid stuff that just keeps coming out. Izzy lost his eyesight. His glasses got thicker and thicker. But he would read this stuff, and then he would see a pattern, and he would collate it. And then he'd be thought of as a great prophet because he could predict what was coming just from what he had read. Well, I have followed the same path, and my eyes are also going.
And you say that before 9/11, there was a Bush administration plan to attack the Taliban. Was that an extension?
No, there was a Clinton plan.
A Clinton plan that the Bush administration picked up or put aside for a while?
Well, what happened was that Clinton decided to go after Osama bin Laden, presumably in Afghanistan. Contingency plans were drawn to strike at Osama bin Laden. And how elaborate it was, I don't know. I think it was pretty elaborate because I think it was going to involve invasion. Then Clinton is voted out of office as the new president. Clinton decides that it is not really a fair thing to do to present a brand new president with a war, which he has launched. So Sandy Berger, who was his national security advisor, handed his successor, Condoleezza Rice, this plan. Said, we have this in the works, and it's pretty much ready to go if you want to. Time magazine, a very arcane, recondite place, published a big story on this last summer. Condoleezza Rice said Berger never gave it to her. And Berger said, I did, and so was also in the room. Well, they disagree. Anyway, what then happened after 9/11 was pretty much, we're all told, the Clinton plan. That's how they could get it going so quickly. They'd thought it through.
We have questions from the audience, and maybe I should. Well, first of all, before we do that, defenders of the president would suggest that whatever you think about the war in Afghanistan, the war with Iraq, that the people of those countries have to be in a better situation today than they were before we went to war.
Well, they have no buildings, I'll say that. And a lot of them, were in bad taste. I mean, it's urban renewal.
Send Frank Gehry in there.
Forced urban renewal. Now, you just have to do that every now and I'm sick and tired of people who criticize me for that. And I got Halliburton there. We're going to have ranch houses up and down the Tigris and Euphrates. And they'll have ranch houses, too. Oh, it's going to be a beautiful place. Really beautiful. You see, we only bring good to people.
This person, these are questions from the audience. This person asks, do you think Fox News has a finite shelf life? Will Fox go the way of Morton Downey?
Oh, God.
You remember Morton Downey?
Of course I do. Tears are already welling in my eyes. Well, let's say Fox deserves to go the way of Morton Downey, yes. And they are so euphoric, and they all shout. I've never heard such loud voices. And they force their voices very high. I went on a couple of times with Chris Matthews. And, he shrieks at you. I actually met him after I was in L.A. and he was in New York or someplace, and we did it long-distance TV. And I saw him at some book thing. They've all written books. And he was signing his books. And then he came up to me and he said, I bet you don't remember me. And I said, no, I was on television with you a few days ago. No, he said, you came to Holy Cross to make a speech in the 1960s. I said, I remember that, yes. He said, well, I was the guy who met you and brought you to the auditorium and so on. I said, well, I have a pretty good memory, but I don't really remember that. Oh, he said, if you think I'm an asshole now, you should have heard me then. He said, I asked you that all the sexual permissiveness now was giving rise to things like, oh God, what was the name of that movie? Anyway, an immoral movie. It was so I mean, like Mother Goose now. It was so, inane. Alfie. Like Alfie, immorality had given birth to the movie Alfie. And I started to laugh as he was telling me the story. He said, that's what you did last time.
Well, actually, you were ahead of the curve with a number of novels. One of the first openly gay novels in America. Then there was Myra Breckinridge before anybody ever thought of transsexuality. There you were.
I think they thought of it.
Excuse me?
You said before anybody had thought of transsexuality.
Well, people had thought of it, but I mean, and we knew about Christine Jorgensen already.
Yes.
But it was not every 16-year-old could talk about it as they can today. If Patriot Act, this person asks, if Patriot Act 2 calls for deportation of those who consort with terrorists, even unknowingly, and if the bin Laden family invested $10 million in Bechtel's financial group, where should we deport Bechtel? That is as reported in the New Yorker.
Well, northeastern Guam is a very attractive piece of real estate. There's nothing there, but you could bring in plants and so on. And you could even make it look like San Francisco, which is where their headquarters is. Put in a cable car or something.
But we are in an odd situation where Bechtel, Halliburton, our closest allies in the Middle East, other than Israel, Saudi Arabia, have all supported terrorists, and yet we seem to look the other way.
Well, that's our job. We don't care about any of these things. This is all noise to distract the people, to convince them that Saddam had something to do with 9/11. He didn't. That he had weapons of mass destruction. He didn't. We knew it. Europeans knew it. There's still some real journalism going on over there. They're not all that better than ourselves, but they're not quite so dishonest, and they don't quite follow, certainly, the USA government's line. You don't read anything in the New York Times. Now they've got a couple of good writers there, like Krugman now. Who occasionally dare to tell the truth, which sometimes involves unveiling the lies of the administration. But they're not enough. And television is just hopeless. I talk to the set. I answer questions. They didn't ask me. I just talk to them. And I turn them off.
Interviewers on the more conservative shows have often criticized you for living outside the country, spending so much time in Italy. I know you're moving back to the U.S. now, but can you imagine what they would have said if you lived in France rather than Italy?
Well, the first thing I would have said would, without the French, we would still be a dependency of England. Our George did not win that revolution. The French fleet did at Yorktown. And for us to go around, in a sense, denouncing our betters, their civilization is older and rather better than ours. It is true, we invented cellophane, and to wrap around small pieces of bad cheese, which is... So, I mean, we have our triumphs, but...
This person writes, you say it is the fault of the people that we have a despot in power. What are your thoughts on the anti-war demonstrations here and across the world? Can that approach be effective?
Well, we have nothing else we can do except the demonstrations. But then the powers that be, I was in L.A., I watched on television how brilliantly the police saw to it that nobody could observe on the TV screen the size of the demonstration here. In L.A., I spoke to 100,000 people in Hollywood Boulevard, and they had a stage at one end at La Brea, and there were 100,000 people all the way up to Vine Street. And I spoke to 100,000. They had helicopters overhead, so that if the audience got too interested, they'd come down very, very low and make a lot of noise. But they finally went away. And not a word. And the LA Times is much, much better than the New York Times. This is not saying much, but it's better. And it does occasionally feel obliged to tell what happened, how many people were in a crowd. But this time they didn't, because this was the big one. So they said, some people said it was 30,000 people, and people seemed unclear about it, and so on. Luckily, a photographer had done a shot behind the stage, on which I happened to be speaking at that moment, of the people all the way, a straight line of them up to Vine Street, and you could see it was 100,000 people that come out. So they say nobody was there, and then they have this photograph, meaning that there are subversives even at the LA Times.
When we had the first anti-war demonstration here, the New York Times reported a lower figure than the New York City police did.
Well, nobody's perfect.
This person asks, could you comment on W. in his flight suit parading around when he was AWOL from his national, when he was AWOL from his National Guard duty?
Well, he certainly stayed out of that war. And Cheney, when asked why he had pulled every string to stay out of Vietnam, actually answered, "I had other priorities." Well, so did 13 million of us who served in that war. So I thought that was a daring thing, but they don't care what they say. The country is theirs. You see today a little bio on Cheney? Oh, it's wonderful. Kicked out of Yale twice. I mean, the question is, how did he get in? Drunken driving. I mean, it's just the catalog of vices and abuses that keeps on. And all we get is, Clinton was a bad man because of that intern. He looks like George Washington now to me.
She's got a job on television. This person asks, if in the unlikely event you were asked to advise a Democratic presidential candidate, what advice would you give? Why an unlikely event?
I've already been asked for advice, and I won't say what I said. I would say that the main line to pursue is to explain the loss of the Bill of Rights. Now, our public is so badly educated, they don't know what it is, and it's not taught in the schools properly. Everybody's very vague about it. Never use the word progressive, and never say we must go forward into the future. Nobody wants to do that, because it's going to be death sooner or later, so don't do it. To win, you must always go backwards. We must go back to the roots of our republic. Yes, that's right, we probably should. And I said, a good word is restoration. Let us restore the Bill of Rights. Mrs. Roosevelt, who was sort of my political teacher, upstate New York, she was optimistic about people, the people, and she said, if you just take the time to explain anything, they'll understand it if it is interesting to them and if it is to their interest to understand. She said, it's not difficult. That's when she was begging me to tell Jack Kennedy not to talk so fast. She said, they can't understand him. I told him to slow down. He said, Eleanor Roosevelt told me I was talking too fast. No love lost between those two.
If you could formulate a new foreign policy for the U.S., what would the first thing be that you would do?
Mind our own business. The country from Washington through J.Q. Adams and later conservatives tended to isolationism, but they've been depicted as a bunch of, thick-headed Neanderthals who were xenophobes, didn't want to have anything to do with anybody. They weren't that. We were always a trading nation from the 18th century on. We supported ourselves by trade. But Washington made it very clear that we must not have special friends or special enemies. We must have goodwill toward all, do business with all, and that was the most you could expect.
But what then would you have done in response to 9/11?
Well, I first would have investigated why it happened. They don't do these things for no reason. I would have gone to the UN. I would say we want a police action. We've been hit by something like the mafia. You don't call out the army to go after the mafia in Appalachia. In Italy, they called out the police to go after the mafia, and they got a great many of the leaders in Sicily, and they never bombed Palermo once.
Didn't you have ambitions for office at one time? In fact, almost make it?
Well, I doubled the Democratic vote in 1960, upstate New York, for Congress. Then it was really mine in '64, and I decided I didn't want to go to the House. In fact, I'd gone back to novel writing, and I thought it was better to write Julian than to be one of 600. I have a horror of anonymity. And as Jack Kennedy always said, the House of Representatives is a can of worms.
Well, I ask that because the last question here is, when are you announcing your candidacy for the presidency in 2004?
See you in Concord, New Hampshire.
We've run out of time. I want to thank you all for coming out here. And just our great thanks to Gore Vidal.
You want to come over here? Here, give me your hand.
Get somebody get the book.
Come along.
Okay, I got it.
Right. Where do we go? Through here?
Right up here. Turn and give him one more bow, okay?
Dreaming War, Blood for Oil, and the Cheney Bush Junta is published by Thunder's Mouth Press, an imprint of Avalon Publishing. Visit avalonpub.com for more information.